And that's the very interesting and I would say important finding that was made a few years ago by my colleague Rob Malenka, who's in our Department of Psychiatry at Stanford, showing that oxytocin and social connection is actually directly stimulating the dopamine pathway. What this paper essentially showed is that oxytocin, social connection, and pair bonding itself triggers dopamine release. And so while it's fun to think about pharmacology and underlying neural circuitry and cold water baths and all these different things related to dopamine schedules and reward mechanisms and attaching reward to effort and all the various things that we've talked about today in terms of science and tools and protocols, I'd be remiss if I didn't include description of this result and just emphasize that social connections, close social connections in particular, that evoke oxytocin release. It doesn't actually require skin contact to get oxytocin release, but oxytocin release is essential to stimulating the dopamine pathways. Engage in, pursue quality, healthy social interactions. I know I've covered a lot of material today. I've really tried hard to focus on things that lie directly within the dopamine pathway and circuitries, as well as things that directly stimulate those pathways and circuitries. What I haven't talked about are all the things that indirectly serve the dopamine pathways. And out there on the internet and indeed in the scientific literature, you will find, for instance, that things like maca root can increase dopamine. Things like the gut microbiome can influence dopamine. And indeed they can, but they do that through indirect mechanisms by creating an environment, a milieu in which dopamine and dopamine circuits can flourish. Maca is a good example of that. It will reduce cortisol and through some indirect pathways related to cortisol can increase dopamine. But it's not a direct increase in dopamine. And so as a consequence, it's rather subtle compared to the various compounds and behaviors that I talked about today. Indeed, cold water exposure leads to huge increases in dopamine, as we talked about before, and very sustained ones at that. I realize in giving you a lot of information about science and mechanism, all the way from psychological and biological to circuitry and synaptic transmission, volumetric transmission, and so forth, that it might seem overwhelming. The most important thing is to understand are that these dopamine pathways really are under your control. And the locus of control resides in the fact that your previous levels of dopamine are influencing your levels of dopamine right now. And your current levels of dopamine and where you take them next will influence your dopamine levels in the next days and weeks to come.